Last week I made this poll, and the results were interesting? Pretty weird, but interesting. How's it going, everyone? This is Ravendraws. Today I'm bringing you a discussion on why perspective matters. A while ago I got this interesting request by YouTube channel Gaming My Whole Life to collaborate on an idea where we pick our favorite camera perspective and make a case or a defense in favor of it. For both of these perspectives, we get to talk about the strengths, talk about why they deserve a place in the franchise, and also what can be improved. His side is just as important to mine on this conversation. This is not a competition. This is just a discussion and an exchange of ideas that we're just doing for the fun of it. Besides, I will be the first one to encourage the idea of getting an alternative perspective on things, so be sure to check out his video as well. I will leave a link in the description and possibly in a pinned comment somewhere down below, but wherever it ends up, make sure to check it out. We understand that this topic is divisive for different reasons, so just like how we try to keep an open mind on things, all we ask of you guys is to just try and do the same. There's no real or fake Resident Evil fans here. Resident Evil is many different things for different people and for different reasons, and it has been like this for the overwhelming majority of the franchise's lifespan. So settle down, grab a snack or a warm and cozy beverage, because today's video is all about the over-the-shoulder camera and why perspective matters. It's time we talk about the big elephant in the room, and that big elephant is the misconception about survival horror in general. Survival horror is a subgenre derived from both the action-adventure genre and the horror genre, and is often confused with other subgenres that emphasize horror with minimal action, such as psychological horror and pure horror. This is important for two reasons. The first one is that a shocking amount of people on this platform have suddenly bought into the idea that action is not a core pillar of the survival horror genre. The second reason is that this idea completely contradicts the statements made by the father of survival horror himself, Shinji Mikami, on several occasions, might I add. Everything that you see on screen right now comes from 4 different sources and outlets, and I'll have the corresponding links down below in the description. This information takes all that we've taken for granted about the genre, flips it on its head, and recontextualizes everything. Now sure, everybody's lasting impression is going to be different when it comes to the classic games. Some people are bound to think that fixed camera angles were intentional, even though they were just used to circumvent technical limitations. Some people are bound to think that puzzles and running away is the real meat and potato of survival horror. But what if these mechanics were just alternative ways to spice things up what was once a shallow combat system? Back then, the combat lacked the tactics and precision that Resident Evil 4 would start to implement going forward. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that despite the subjectivity when it comes to interpretations on the horror elements of Resident Evil, it's pretty evident that Resident Evil was always designed to be a confrontational horror game. Even in the early days of the fixed camera angles. Sure, your first 2 or 3 runs you're being a dummy and wasting all your ammo like I did and everyone else did, but after that you'll quickly notice that even the classic games were giving you a heck of a ton of ammo to deal with everything. Even the hardest of the classics, Code Veronica and Zero, are filled to the brim with ammo and supplies if you know what you're doing. Does this suddenly invalidate the old school fixed camera angle horror games leading up to the over-the-shoulder overhaul that eventually replaced this system? What? Hell no. Believe it or not, I think that fixed camera angles was one of the best accidents to ever happen to horror games. Horror is unbelievably subjective, and the greater the variety of gameplay styles and camera angles on offer, the less predictable everything gets, and hypothetically, the better the outcome. And that is the point I'm trying to make. The question we should be asking ourselves is not, why won't over-the-shoulder cameras die already so that fixed camera angles can come back? The real question we should be asking is, why aren't fixed camera angles being utilized in tandem? Why can't these two systems live side by side? Neither one of these camera styles is the right or the wrong answer. Survival horror is not a constant. It's a mix of variables that change and adapt according to what each particular game or project entails. Camera angles do not define the genre. They simply define the balance that gets struck within the parameters of said genre. And the same way that the FCA system does not deserve to go extinct, neither does the OTS system that the industry has heavily relied on for the last 16 years. They both deserve a place within the future of survival horror. The franchise has a tendency of seesawing back and forth between 60% horror to 40% action and a 40% horror to 60% action ratio. The latter ratio has a tendency of being referred to as action horror with the intent of separating it from survival horror. But since the genre itself is already inherently a derivative of the action-adventure genre, that extra little bit of distinction is completely redundant here. Some games even tip over these ratios a little bit too much to even be considered survival horror, and on a couple of very rare occasions, they strike an almost perfect equilibrium of 50-50. Keyword here being almost. What's important to note here though is that these ratios are not exclusive to one camera style or the other, but it's clear that each style will facilitate reaching a specific ratio of action and horror more efficiently. It just depends on what you want to lean towards the most. If it is towards action and satisfying combat, which is no doubt one of the most appealing things about the genre, you cannot go wrong with an over-the-shoulder style camera. With the design philosophy of survival horror now explained, I'm hoping that serves as enough context for the following points. The over-the-shoulder camera has one massive advantage when it comes to the user experience. It is pivoted around the playable character. Mechanically speaking, this has many benefits and very few caveats. A camera that is pivoted around the playable character helps the player maintain a good sense of direction, which is essential given the emphasis on exploration and backtracking. Strictly from a gameplay standpoint, this point of view is actually the most ideal one. There's a good balance of freedom and restriction to movement and precision. It's a perfect marriage between the omniscience of third-person storytelling that fixed cameras can convey and the claustrophobic navigation and a narrow field of view and laser focus on smaller details that you usually get with first-person shooters. It's practically the best of both worlds. There's a common denominator in survival horror games that is prevalent no matter which camera style gets applied. That common denominator is the fear of the unknown. It is universal and instinctual to anticipate the unknown, to dread the chaos inflicted on the order in which we strive for in our day-to-day lives. And this chaos can be exploited regardless of which camera perspective is used. Each particular camera can cause this chaos in its own particular way, and the OTS camera is no different in this regard. It's the approach that differentiates, not the horror itself. Fixed camera angles can orchestrate scares that otherwise would not work from other perspectives, because they are capable of causing fear of the unknown in a way that cannot be achieved in real life, such as obstructing things that are right in front of the character but the player cannot see. This type of orchestrated horror works brilliantly for some people with a high suspension of disbelief, but for those of us with a lower suspension of disbelief, this tactic backfires all the time and instead ruins the immersion. Let me explain. Horror works on an emotional level, and so does suspense. The idea of suspense is that the audience is given information as to what is going to happen next, but the information is withheld from the character. With fixed camera angles, the opposite happens. The character is given the information. For example, the main character enters a corridor with zombies in it, so it is clear that they can see the threat, but because the camera angles hide the threat from the player, the game is then withholding that information from the player as well. This withholding of information creates neither suspense nor shock value, because there is a different piece of information that the audience already knows beforehand. What the audience already knows is that the playable character already sees the threat, hears the threat, or both. So with that information already available to the player, the punchline, which is in the form of a jump scare or a camera cutting to another shot, it gets lost because it comes across as disingenuous. Over-the-shoulder camera doesn't have this problem because the game treats the player's point of view and the character's point of view as one and the same, which in the end, that is the ultimate goal of a proactive medium like a video game, to roleplay and to be in the shoes of another person and to be in control of the information, as long as the information is within the bounds of realism to stay immersed. The ultimate goal of suspense is not to have you know everything. The goal is to have you know enough to get you worked up. And since fixed camera angles are a third-person omniscient perspective, meanwhile the OTS is a third-person limited perspective, the limited point of view does exactly that. This is why a decapitation in Resident Evil 4 is still unsettling, meanwhile the scare tactics of seeing an enemy jump out of a specific camera angle no longer works once you've seen it and heard it. Fixed cameras set up and plan the suspense and or dread for you, whereas with the OTS camera, the suspense and or dread is set up differently. Instead, the way this camera system works is in more of a blunt and an honest way. It just throws you into the thick of it, tells you the bare minimum you need to know, and the rest is up to you. It's not holding your hand, on the contrary, it's expecting you to know how to handle things on your own. And that's where the dread comes in with the OTS camera. It is doing exactly what survival horror is supposed to do, and that is test your skills to survive. It's in the name, survival horror. It's not called runaway horror, and it's not called boomstick horror either, because survival is doing whatever it takes at all costs to survive. In the end, both options are valid, and the choice is up to you. And on that note, the Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you guys for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you loved the video, hit the notification bell. Check out my backlog. And if you completely disagree with me, well, even if you agree with me, check out Gaming My Whole Life's great video he made about fixed camera angles. We are all Resident Evil fans, and there's no reason we cannot get along and enjoy the games. After all, perspective matters.